Manhattan, 1979. The sidewalk on Bleecker Street was crowded that afternoon, the kind of New York chaos where everyone moved with purpose, where Lou Reed could walk relatively unnoticed despite his dark sunglasses and leather jacket. But on this particular October day, someone broke that unwritten rule. A woman in her early 30s stepped directly into his path, her hands trembling, her voice cutting through the street noise like a knife. "You ruined my life," she said. Lou Reed stopped walking. What happened in the next 3 minutes would remain hidden for 40 years. A conversation so raw that the few witnesses who heard it swore they would never speak of it. Until now. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind rock's most enigmatic figures, subscribe to this channel. We bring you the stories that changed music history, one revelation at a time. To understand what happened on that street corner, you have to understand where Lou Reed was in 1979. This wasn't the triumphant artist of the Transformer era. This was Lou Reed in the aftermath. The heroin years had left their mark. Rachel Humphreys, the person he had loved most intensely, was gone. The punk movement he had inadvertently inspired was now dismissing him as yesterday's news. Reed walked the streets of Manhattan like a ghost haunting his own past, and on most days, people left him alone. They sensed something fragile beneath the attitude, something that might shatter if pushed. The woman who stopped him that day understood this fragility better than anyone. Her name was never publicly revealed, but those who witnessed the encounter remembered certain details. She wore a gray coat despite the mild weather. Her eyes were red, not from crying but from something deeper, a kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying weight too long. She wasn't a groupie seeking attention. She wasn't a journalist chasing a story. She was something far more dangerous to Lou Reed's carefully constructed armor. She was a mirror. "You ruined my life." The words hung between them as pedestrians flowed around this sudden island of stillness. Reed didn't immediately respond. He removed his sunglasses, a gesture those who knew him recognized as significant. Lou Reed never removed his sunglasses in public. They were his shield, his barrier between the world and whatever darkness lived behind his eyes. But he removed them now, and the woman saw what few people ever did. The exhaustion, the recognition, the guilt. She continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Walk on the Wild Side, that song. You made it sound romantic. You made it sound like an adventure." Reed knew immediately which verse she meant. The song had featured real people from Andy Warhol's factory scene, individuals whose lives intersected with New York's underground culture. The song had been a hit, a crossover success that brought Reed commercial recognition. He had never achieved with the Velvet Underground. But commercial success always has a price, and sometimes the people who pay that price are the ones never mentioned in the liner notes. The woman's story unfolded there on Bleecker Street. She had been 17 when the song became a radio staple in 1973. She had heard the lyrics, the casual references to the factory scene, and she had heard something her small town in Pennsylvania could never offer. Permission. Permission to be different. Permission to chase something beyond the suffocating normalcy of suburban life. So she had come to New York in 1974, barely 18, with $200 and a head full of Lou Reed lyrics. She had believed the song was a roadmap. She had believed it was an invitation. What the woman found in New York wasn't romance. It was survival. The factory scene Reed had documented was already fragmenting by 1974. Andy Warhol had survived being shot, and had retreated from the wilder aspects of his earlier empire. The glamorous misfits Reed had celebrated in song were struggling with addiction, poverty, and the aftermath of living fast. The woman found herself in a city that devoured innocence, and the song that had brought her there offered no guidance for what came next. She became exactly what she had run away from, trapped and desperate, but now in a city that didn't care enough to even judge. She had fallen into patterns that the song had described but never warned against. The song had aestheticized pain, turned survival into poetry, made degradation sound like rebellion, and she had been young enough to believe it. By 1979, 5 years later, she had clawed her way back to something resembling stability. She had gotten clean. She had found a job. She had survived. But the anger remained. "You made it sound beautiful," she told him on that street corner. "You made it sound like freedom." Reed's response, when it finally came, wasn't what anyone expected. Lou Reed had grown up understanding consequences. The electroshock therapy his parents had subjected him to as a teenager, attempting to cure his bisexuality, had taught him that actions have prices, and that sometimes those prices are paid by people who never agreed to the transaction. He had spent years processing that trauma through his music, turning personal hell into art that spoke to outsiders, to the damaged, to those who didn't fit. But success had brought a realization he hadn't anticipated. His songs were no longer just his pain transformed into poetry. They were instructions that some listeners followed literally. By the mid-70s, Reed was receiving letters. Some were grateful, people telling him his honesty had saved their lives. But others were accusations, people who had taken his lyrics as blueprints and found themselves lost. Parents who blamed his songs for their children's choices. Journalists who asked if he felt responsible for romanticizing addiction. Reed's public responses were typically defensive, sometimes hostile. He would argue that art wasn't an instruction manual, that he had simply documented reality. But privately, according to those close to him, the weight accumulated. Laurie Anderson, who would later become his wife, once described finding Reed at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, reading fan letters that cataloged how his songs had changed lives, both for better and worse. He kept these letters in a box he never showed anyone. Some were suicide notes. Others were thank you letters. Reed couldn't reconcile these contradictions. How could the same song save one person and destroy another? Back on Bleecker Street, the woman waited for Lou Reed's response. The silence stretched longer than seemed natural. Reed wasn't preparing a defensive retort. He wasn't searching for a clever dismissal. He was deciding whether to tell the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I know," he said. "I know what I did." The simplicity of those words, the lack of justification or excuse, seemed to surprise the woman. She had clearly prepared for argument, for Reed's famous hostility. But Reed continued, and what he said next would explain why this conversation remained hidden for so long. The song wasn't an invitation, Reed told her. It was a warning no one heard correctly. I was trying to show what actually happens, not what should happen. But I made it sound too good. I put a melody on top of misery, and people heard the melody. He paused. I was documenting my friends destroying themselves, and somehow it came out sounding like a travel guide. The woman's anger seemed to waver. This wasn't the Lou Reed of interviews. This was something rawer, an admission of artistic failure from someone who had built his career on never admitting failure. Reed continued, his voice dropping even lower. I think about them. I turned their lives into a hit single, and most of them are dead now. Overdoses, suicides. I made them famous in a way they never asked for, and I'm still here, still making money from their misery. The woman asked the question everyone was thinking. So why did you do it? Reed's answer revealed the central tension of his artistic life. Because it was the only way I knew how to love them. I couldn't save them. I couldn't make their lives easier. But I could make sure people knew they existed, that they mattered. I thought documentation was enough. I thought making beautiful art from ugly truth was a form of respect. He took off his sunglasses again, and the woman could see tears he wasn't bothering to hide. But you're right. I made it sound too beautiful. I aestheticized pain because that's what artists do. And I never stopped to think about who might hear that beauty and mistake it for permission. I never thought about the 17-year-old kids who would hear that song and think I was offering them a way out when I was actually describing a way to get trapped. The woman had come expecting vindication, expecting Lou Reed to confirm her anger. But this vulnerability, this raw admission of guilt, left her without the satisfaction she had sought. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Reed's response was immediate. "Survive anyway. Survive in spite of my song. Prove that you're stronger than my poetry. I can't undo the art. It exists. But you survived. You came back. You found me and told me the truth. That's already more than most people do." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. He wrote something quickly, tore out the page, and handed it to her. The witnesses couldn't see what was written, but the woman's reaction was visible. She read it, looked at Reed with an expression somewhere between shock and something close to forgiveness, then carefully folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. Reed put his sunglasses back on, nodded once, and continued walking. The woman stood still for a moment, then walked in the opposite direction. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 5 minutes. For 40 years, no one knew what Lou Reed had written on that piece of paper. The witnesses went on with their lives. Reed never publicly mentioned the encounter. The truth emerged in 2019 when a music journalist researching the factory scene interviewed a therapist who had treated people drawn to that world. One patient had given permission for the therapist to share one detail about an encounter with Lou Reed. The note contained a single sentence and a phone number. The sentence read, "Surviving what I wrote about makes you more real than anything I ever wrote." The phone number was Reed's personal line. The patient had called once, several years after the encounter, during a difficult moment. Reed had answered, had recognized her voice immediately, and had talked with her for nearly an hour. Not about music, but about survival, about rebuilding, about living beyond the mythology others create around you. This revelation led to further investigation, and what emerged suggested the Bleecker Street encounter wasn't isolated. Reed had maintained quiet contact with several people who reached out about the impact of his songs. These weren't public relationships. They were private conversations, occasional phone calls, sometimes financial support provided through intermediaries. One former assistant described discovering a separate ledger Reed maintained personally, listing amounts being paid to rehab facilities and housing support programs. When asked about it, Reed had simply said, "I take care of my own." A music producer who worked with Reed in the 90s recalled recording sessions interrupted by phone calls Reed insisted on taking privately. He would be gone for 40 minutes, and when he returned, he looked emotionally drained. "Someone needed to talk," was all he said. This happened repeatedly, always the same insistence on privacy. always the same exhaustion afterward. By the 2000s, Reed's relationship with his catalog had evolved into something complex. He continued to perform the controversial song because audiences demanded it. But people who attended his later shows noticed changes in delivery. The tempo was slower. The delivery was less playful, more documentary. He would sometimes introduce it with a moment of silence, as if gathering strength. Laurie Anderson spoke carefully about his relationship with his earlier work after his death in 2013. She described finding him listening to the song on headphones, something she had never seen. When she asked why, he said he was trying to hear it the way a 17-year-old might hear it for the first time. "Can you hear the warning?" he asked her. Anderson told him she could, but she understood why others might not. "That's the problem with making misery beautiful," Reed had responded. "People fall in love with the beauty and don't notice the misery until it's too late." The identity of the woman remained protected until 2021, when she chose to come forward for a podcast series about music's impact on mental health. She was in her early 60s, using only her first name, Jennifer. She spoke with remarkable clarity about both her anger at Lou Reed and her eventual understanding of artistic responsibility. Jennifer described the years following the encounter as transformative. Reed's admission of guilt had paradoxically freed her from some of her anger. "I had built him up as this callous artist who didn't care," she explained. "Finding out he did care, that he carried guilt about it, meant I couldn't just blame him anymore. I had to take responsibility for my own choices. That was harder than anger, but it was also the beginning of real healing." She revealed using Reed's phone number 3 times over the years. The first call, in the mid-80s, lasted an hour and covered what she described as the practical reality of rebuilding. Reed had been direct, almost clinical, offering specific advice about support systems, employment, dealing with trauma. "He didn't try to be my friend," Jennifer said. "He was more like a consultant who had information I needed." The second call came in the early 90s during a personal crisis. Reed had told her, "The fact that you're still calling means you're still fighting. People who give up don't make the effort. You're going to be fine." The third call came in 2009, shortly after she heard Reed was dealing with health issues. "I wanted him to know that I had made it, that his song hadn't ruined me permanently." That 2009 conversation revealed a side of Lou Reed few encountered. According to Jennifer, he answered with his typical brusque greeting, but his tone changed when he recognized her voice. "I wondered if I would hear from you again," he said. Jennifer told him about her life, her children, her career in social services helping young people who came to New York with dreams but no resources. Reed listened without interrupting. "You turned it around," Reed finally said. "You took the worst thing that happened and made it useful for other people. That's better than writing a song about it." Jennifer realized Reed had been waiting for permission to let go of guilt he had carried for 3 decades. She explicitly gave him that permission. "I told him he couldn't be responsible for every person who misunderstood his art, that I had made my choices and owned them now." Reed's response: "I appreciate you saying that, but I'm not going to stop feeling responsible. That's my weight to carry, not yours to lift. But I'm glad you made it out. That's the only redemption any of this gets." They talked for 20 minutes about the nature of influence, the impossibility of predicting how art affects people. Reed told her about others who had reached out over the years. "I can't fix what my songs did," he said. "I can only listen and try to help if they ask. That's all I've got." After Reed's death, Laurie Anderson gradually shared details that complicated his public image. In 2018, she revealed that Reed had maintained a private journal distinct from his songwriting notebooks. This journal contained reflections on his artistic legacy, and specifically on people who had reached out about being influenced or harmed by his work. One entry Anderson shared: "I spent my early career thinking I was making art for the damaged people, the outsiders. But I was actually making art that documented them for mainstream consumption. I turned their lives into entertainment for people who would never have to live those lives. That's exploitation with good intentions. The least I can do now is answer the phone when the consequences call." Another entry from 2011 reflected on the Bleecker Street encounter. "Jennifer called today. She has kids now, a life. She told me to stop feeling guilty. But guilt isn't something you stop feeling because someone gives you permission. Guilt is the price of influence. If your art matters enough to change lives, you have to accept that some of those changes will be catastrophic. That's the deal no one tells you about." The woman on Bleecker Street in 1979 did something most people never do. She demanded accountability from an artist whose work had influenced her life catastrophically. She confronted Lou Reed directly with the consequences of his art. What she triggered wasn't a public apology or a change in Reed's persona. It triggered something more private and sustained: a decades-long practice of engagement with people his work had affected. This story remained hidden for 40 years because everyone involved understood it was more meaningful as private practice than public narrative. Reed didn't want credit for restitution attempts. The people he helped wanted privacy. Only after his death did the full scope become clear through researchers, therapists, and Jennifer's decision to speak. What we're left with is a more complicated portrait of Lou Reed. Not the callous artist who didn't care, but not the tormented soul seeking redemption either. Something in between. An artist who made work that mattered, who couldn't control how it was interpreted, who felt responsible anyway, and who tried to address that responsibility through private action rather than public performance. An artist who answered the phone when consequences called. Jennifer, now in her 60s, has become an advocate for understanding the complex relationship between art and influence. She works with young people seeking the kind of freedom Reed once documented. Lou Reed showed the reality, she tells them. Your job is to learn from that reality without having to live through it. His art cost him something. It cost me something. Let it cost you nothing but knowledge. The note Reed wrote in 1979, those words about surviving making you more real than anything he wrote, captured something essential. The people who survive reality, who rebuild from wreckage, who turn catastrophe into resilience, they're more real than any song. Lou Reed knew that. He spent the last 34 years of his life making sure the people he had inadvertently influenced understood it too. That's a legacy as important as the music itself.